Well, it's so nice to be back here again. I was here in 2019 for the release of my first book, The Abolitionist's Daughter, which is set in pre-Civil War, Civil War, post-Civil War, over in Webster County, before the old ghost town of Greensboro, of which there's nothing left but an abandoned graveyard. So this time it's a very different setting. It's New Orleans, 1900, the second ball of the first female crew of New Orleans Mardi Gras. And was a time of immense change in every direction, socially, technologically, inventions, exploration, sort of the coming of the modern era. It was also a time of a lot of efforts by women to work towards equality and women's rights, particularly the right to vote, which was achieved 20 years later. So this book is set in 1900 New Orleans. It's the second ball of this all-female crew who were turning the tables on men socially under the guise of leap year and the right of women to ask men for a date, ask men to dinner, ask men for a dance. One woman asked a man to marry her. And the first ball was in 1896. That is a leap year. So 4 years later, we have another leap year, right?
Ideally.
No. This was news to me, and I think it was news to some of them. At the turn of the century, if it's a leap year on the double zero numbers, it has to be able to be divided by 400, or they don't add the extra day to February. It's. I know.
Who makes that rule?
Whoever devises those calendars and has to make our days, set up with the moon or the stars or whatever it is we do, that we get those funny leap years to make our days work out with the rotation around the sun. Anyway, these women decided that most people wouldn't know that, and it was 4 years later, so they were just going to act like it was another leap year. They had been so successful on the first one. So that's the historical setting. Now, Mardi Gras in those days was not parades and beads and throwing all the stuff. There were these very fancy dress balls. And this women's crew, Les Mystérieuses, the mysterious ones, they could decide to be totally incognito so that no one would know them. Or if they chose to reveal their identity, they could do that. So there was fun, and there was subterfuge, and there was a little, okay, the men have to wait to be called out to the dance. The men have to wait for their invitation to come. The men don't get to be in control here. And instead of having one queen, they had 4 queens for the four fair queens for the 4 points of the compass dealing, so you had, let me see, Pocahontas, Brunhilde, Juliet, and Semiramis. Semiramis being, she had been the wife of Mesopotamian king, and he died. She had a child who was far too young to become ruler, and so she took over herself. And she did amazing things like triple the size of the empire and build all these amazing roads and buildings and improve the lot of the people until it came time for her son to take over as ruler. So that's the historical setting. That's the social setup behind the book. The plot is really has to do with it. You all have read Dual Timelines, I'm sure, a lot of them lately, and it's usually someone in the present who's discovering some secret from the past. This book is Dual Timeline, but it's two simultaneous stories that are taking place at the same time. Constance in New Orleans, on the lower echelon of the upper crust, with a husband who's a social climber and ambitious and a little I never quite said that sentence like that, so I don't know the word for it. But he's not altogether honest. And he keeps bugging her for money. Now, what was interesting in Louisiana is that under Napoleonic law, which was different from anywhere else in the U.S., women actually had more rights than anywhere else. And so they could own their own property, they could have their own money, and if they married or if they were married and inherited something, it didn't automatically then go to the ownership of the husband. It remained in her ownership. And also, in some places, in some situations, they even had the right to vote on certain issues, not necessarily on big elections, but on changes, say, for the sidewalks or paving over the open sanitation, which was huge. So that's Constance, and her husband is hounding her for money from her trust. She's not having it. She's not going to do it. Okay, in Chicago, Alice has come from the plains. Her mother, all her life, has been teaching her very fine sewing skills, embroidery skills, beading skills, because she knows that out there on the plains, the men are going to inherit the land, the brothers are going to have the land, she's going to have nothing, and she's going to be at the mercy of whoever the closest single man that will have her out there on the farms. So she wants her to go to Chicago and have a life. She wants her to go to the city and have a different life. And she's been squirreling away her pennies and her little extra money so to have some funding for her daughter to get to Chicago. So Alice is in Chicago. She's used these wonderful skills from her mother to get employment with Carson Peary Scott as a seamstress and doing alterations. She meets a very gentlemanly, decorous man, they get married, have a child who dies of a fever. And one evening, he travels as a cotton broker on the railroad. He doesn't return. And he doesn't return, and he doesn't return. And the police are not sympathetic to her case at all. And so she's left on her own with just a few days left on the rent and almost nothing for food. And she has discovered that she's pregnant since his disappearance. So she gets on the train and she goes to New Orleans. Now, one of the things I love about historical fiction is happening upon the timeliness of different things. So this timeliness of women's rights, women are still struggling for equal pay. For example, it wasn't a pandemic, but there were multiple epidemics of yellow fever, typhoid fever, and cholera in New Orleans. So New Orleans was filled with orphanages and hundreds of orphans. And it's through these orphanages that these two women come together. Constance as part of a group of women who support the orphanage, and Alice as having been given refuge in one of the orphanages in exchange for teaching these girls her sewing skills to give them a trade so they don't wind up in workrooms for 12 hours a day. So that's how these two come together. And from there, it moves into the making of this dress, and Constance being incognito because she's a new widow. Come on in. So that's kind of just a general umbrella of who you'll meet in the book, and what the book is about, the deeper themes. It's really looking at how, first of all, the courage, the kind of courage and strength that we don't know we have, but that's required of us, I want to say almost daily, for something or another. And sometimes it's overwhelming. Sometimes we think it's something we can't even possibly deal with. And yet we find a way to do so. Yeah. Come on. So it's looking at what it takes from all of us, men and women. I mean, it happens to be women in this story. But that courage and strength that we have to pull out of ourselves constantly. My friend in Tupelo, I was having in Tupelo today, and she was talking about when things had gotten a little difficult and how all her friends had just come together to support her. So it's looking at community, and it's looking at how our relationships, sometimes unexpected relationships with others, bring us into those wells of strength that we didn't even know that we had, and bring the whole community into a greater achieved in that way. And there are lots of other tidbits here. Of course, you know, it's enough pages to make a novel. So, you know, I'm picking little bits of stuff here and there, and the other, and saying, oh, look, this fits. Oh, what? Yes, this fits. So, a lot of people ask me about research. And I just have to tell you right off the bat, this is confession, I was not a history student. I did not like memorizing names and dates and places and filling them into the blank. It did not interest me. But now, looking at these larger umbrellas of pieces of history, I find myself just, because it's human stories. It's who we are. It's who we've always been in different sets of circumstances. And I find myself just loving it. And as I said, the little known aspects of history, those just fascinate me. And then details. I'm you know, riding along and saying, oh, and then she needed to decide, she needed to get home and fix the supper, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, okay, what would she have fixed, first of all? But wait, did she have a gas stove or a wood stove in 1900? And when she cleaned the dishes, would she have had a wash basin, or would she have had a porcelain sink? And did she have running water? So suddenly I'm down a rabbit hole, following all these threads that just get utterly wonderful. And I can spend half a day, you know, in the rabbit hole looking up all these what kind of buttons. Would they have been wooden buttons or mother of pearl buttons, would they have had buttons because they would have had to have embroidered the buttonholes, you know? And what kind of sewing machine would it have been? Did they have the sewing machine in 1900? And if they did, how did it operate? I discovered it operated exactly like that dreidel machine that I learned to sew on. So I figured I sort of knew what they were doing with the machines. I'll tell you a funny story. I learned to drive in my father's Model T car. So then I went to live in France. And as a student, when I was here, and I lived with a French family who collected antique cars. And so that collection of antique cars is now in the museum at Le Mans. And I drove across France. I learned to drive some of those old cars. I rode across France with, you know, they'd have a rally of 50, 100 cars. We'd go across France. So I got the cars. You know, I got it. So I've written this character. Her name is Dorothea Richard, and she's sort of a mentor of these two young women. And she is a woman of determination, and she's the captain of this crew. She's on her way. She is progressing, and so she's learned to drive a car, and she's driving this car, and she comes up to Constance's house, and I've got her. You know, she's turning the wheel, and she's pulling right into that parking place, and changing the gear, and doing the brake, and, you know, I got it all. And I've even got decorations on the fenders, and I think, okay, all I need is a make of the car. What make of the car would it have been in 1900? And I said, well, okay, I'll look up a make. I look up the cars in 1900 New Orleans. Well, talk about timely. The internal combustion engine was just barely being developed. There were some cars that were run by steam. The rest of them, electric. Yeah, isn't that great?
Wow.
So then I have to go, and so for there to be an electric car, okay, here, I'm going to have to move a second to do this. Okay, for the electric car, you had a tiller, like a boat, that so there was no steering wheel, no gears, just the tiller, and a throttle, like you have on a motorboat. So I have to go back and rewrite Dorothea's commanding arrival with the tiller and the throttle. So that's just a small bit of minutia about the ways of research. So I'm going to stop right there and ask you if you have any questions.
Would you be my history teacher?
You know, I would love to be. You know, when I was a sophomore in college, I had a history teacher who actually, he sat up on the front of the desk and told us the story of history. And I loved it, and I loved him, and I worked as hard for him as I've ever worked on any course in my life, and I could never make better than a B. I just couldn't do it. But it didn't matter. I loved learning history from him. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you ever lived in New Orleans?
Yeah, well, sort of. After Katrina, I had an apartment in the quarter for about 2 years. And my good friend who lived there and had gotten me to come down was Queen of Iris, which is the current, well, there's more than one, but it's the big female crew. And it's the longest lasting. It's been the longest lived crew of women's crew. And so I rode on her float and participated in the balls and all of that. And that's where I got interested and started spending time in the archives at Tulane and the Historical Society and going to the museums and rummaging through Diane's warehouse of costumes. And so I sort of lived there.
Wow, 2 years sounds like you lived there.
Well, I wasn't there all the time. I was back and forth.
So, at the beginning, you were telling us about the crew. Is that part fiction, or was there really?
No, that part is history.
Oh, yay!
That part is history.
And did you stumble upon the fact that they didn't have a leap year that year, leap day that year?
Well,
Or did you already
you know,
that?
these women acted as if it were leap year. They just went ahead as if it were leap year. So they called it the leap year ball, and I didn't know anything about those double zeros.
No.
So I'm treating it as if it's leap year. And my editor writes me and says, 1900 is not a leap year. And I'm in an argument with my editor. No, of course it's a leap year. It's 4 years. No, it can't be divided by 400. So then I'm off on this other rabbit hole and learning all about how they determine the leap years. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Yeah.
So that was fascinating hearing. It was fascinating to hear how you incorporate the research into the story, like, you know, with the little details. But do you have certain things like, you know, when you have the idea for the story, do you have certain things you want to get in there, and do you have to sometimes leave things out? Is that painful? Like, I really want to get this detail in there, but no, that's not going to work, or is it how's that process work?
Yes and yes. Yes, I do find things that I would really like to include, but it's like a sidetrack. It's like off the subject, you know, and so you just put those aside for maybe they'll go somewhere else in another book, you know. And I'm not an organized person to begin with, you know. And people say, well, do you write from 8 to 12, and or do you write a certain number of pages? And I'm like, no. Well, well, I sort of write when I can, and I write when I write. And I'm not an outliner. And one reason I'm not an outliner is because I don't know where I'm going. Now, I know an outline is supposed to help you know where you're going, but it feels confining to me, because then I feel like I'm making it up. And my first writing teacher was Madeline Lingle, A Wrinkle in Time. And you probably have her book, Walking on Water. And her premise is, in a nutshell, that the work knows more than you do. It's not yours. It comes to you from somewhere else and asks to be born, like an annunciation. And if you say yes, then your job is to follow the work where it knows it needs to go. My first career is as a painter and gallery director, and when I discovered that book, it literally changed my life, changed my approach to everything. And you'll hear lots of authors, I'm sure you've heard it over and over, who say, well, no, it just sort of came out of, I don't know where it came from. It just came from somewhere. And I find that to be very true. I can have the sort of umbrella ideas, like I knew the basic story, which I haven't given you. It's got a little twist in it. This is a murder mystery. It may not sound like it, but it is. But the ins and outs of how that comes to be and how the characters relate to one another is, I mean, Dorothea Richards just showed up. She said, count me in, you know. And in the first book, I had one character she's a little off, and well, more than a little, and I couldn't ever figure out why. And finally, one day, I sat down at the keyboard and said, "Okay, you just have to tell me." And nope, not doing it. So I sat there and I said, "Okay, I can sit. I am patient." Waited. Finally, I said, okay, we'll do it another way. What's your favorite color? Blue. What's your favorite fruit? Strawberries. What's the deal with you and that fan? And she just started this riptide of information that in a million years I could never have imaginatively made up on my own. And it answered every empty hole in character, relationships, plot, everything. So, that might have gotten far afield from your question, but.
Perfect, thank you.
Anyone else? Would you like some books signed?
Yeah.
All right, thank you all very much.